Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this week is both a catch-up week, but also one dominated by a lot of contrast. Half super aggro and aggressive and in your face. The other half very sweet and light and sugary. So clearly emblematic of our very conflicted times. Don't think about that too hard. I certainly didn't. This is On the Pulse. So we got 8 albums in the docket. Let's first go back and talk about From Health, Disco 4, Part 1. This is another one of those acts for which I'm kind of surprised it's taken me this long to talk about them, and they're kind of an odd project to discuss in any capacity. The best way to describe Health is, okay, what if we mix a lot of grinding industrial textures with a dream pop sensibility, emphasis on pop that will later flesh out on multiple remix albums, oh, and also make the Max Payne 3 soundtrack, which is way better than it has any right to be. And you know what, I do think the synthesis could probably work. At the very least, the percussion is excellent, and when the albums can build to some solid grooves, they almost help override my desire for stronger vocals with any sense of potent presence or engagement or lyrics that feel a little less cliched. But the Disco series of remix albums kind of intrigued me, especially when this new one was cited as more of a compilation of fresh songs with some notable guest stars stepping up. But to some extent, this is really a modern, pop-accessible Health album if you are comfortable with those industrial touches, for better and worse. Hell, if anything, the twist in the production and sound, they seem almost more impacted by the guests deviating from Health's usual formula, which in the content circles a lot of the same abstract attachment, lost connections, and gothic depression. We've been in this before. Now, that's not saying there aren't some potent moments. Cyberpunk 2020 is a nice misty opener with a great drum line. Power Fantasy sounds pretty much exactly like the contorted 100 gex crossover that it is. JPEGMAFIA drops a viciously nihilistic verse on Hate You as the synths will stutter and grind. And really, given how many industrial tones that Ghostemane's been playing with recently, Judgment Day, it makes way too much sense. Now for me, the nice surprises came with the industrial / screamo gallop on Innocence with Youth Code, and the haunted rollick with Shoo Shoo on Delicious Ape. But on the flip side, I really do wish that song with Full of Hell managed to actually come together, or that more of the back half of this album could muster a hook beyond some increasingly fractured atmosphere building, which I will say ends pretty decently, but also feels kind of abortive. And man, I wish that song with Soccer Mommy was a lot better too. But overall, you know what, there are good moments here, but few great or truly memorable ones. Health is very much locked into their comfort zone at this point, and frankly, they need to be the ones to break out of it, not their impressive arsenal of guest stars. So with that, strong 6 out of 10, good atmosphere. I wanted to like this more. Next up from Oneohtrix Point Never, Magic Oneohtrix Point Never. This has been long in coming. See, the funny thing is that I've actually talked about Daniel Lobaton's work as Oneohtrix Point Never before, and behind the scenes as a producer for a while, partially driven in me doing a deep dive of his material 2 years ago to prep for a review of Age of that I never had the time to release properly. It was 2018, that happened. So here's my long overdue update. I made a comparison with Otecker in terms of experimental electronic music that kind of does its own abstract thing in its own off-kilter space, but Oneohtrix Point Never isn't really as alien and certainly feels more in your face, but especially after R+7 and Garden of Deletes, the tones might be more fractured and organic, but are more monochromatic and yet still feel oddly distant, where the inclusion of vocals only serve to amplify that sense of self-contained oddness. Age of, especially, it feels like a wonky but kind of sterile hodgepodge of old half-formed ideas that even felt even more alienating. But alright, maybe the ship would correct on the somewhat self-titled album? Well, I'd argue it's a little more accessible. There's a lot more vocal snippets from acts like The Weeknd, Carolyn Polachek, rapper Nolan B. Rollin. Hell, it's probably Lobaton's brightest project since R+7 in terms of the sampling, and a lot of the instrumental palette palette, especially on the front half, which you could argue makes it feel even more sharply discordant when you think about it, cycling through fractured radio stations on a tangled and unknowable road ahead, where evolution might be protested, but it pretty much is inevitable. And I mean evolution in the scientific sense, where no guarantee that the traits coming out of it will help us in the long run, but they'll just happen. But they can even lead to beauty, like the strings emerging from the glitch on Amajo. It also matches some of the thematic parallels to the unpredictable hugeness of the weather, or the scattered detritus but occasional beauty of trash, which touches off the fractured but oddly soothing cycles of a lot of the instrumental cuts here. The synths will splash off the strings and the auto-tuned vocals, shuffling grooves will break across the glitchy fuzz guitar. It's something that's strikingly reminiscent of some late 90s electronic rock, and even the closest thing to a contorted hip-hop instrumental after plenty of warped wheedling on the Weather Channel. Labatin's been working in this territory before, and it does come through here decently well. That being said, I'm still not quite convinced Labatin can carry a vocal performance on his own, so the off-key clunker of Lost But Never Alone comes as a real late album dud. He describes it as Depeche Mode meets Def Leppard, and I kind of feel insulted as somebody who kind of likes both. And even if the album feels like cycling through a 24-hour day of abstract, weird radio programming, some of the synthwave sleepiness in the back half can feel a little underwhelming, even if it does end on a nice note of wistful hope. But as a whole, it's tough to call this a return to form, given that Oneohtrix Point Never has kind of evolved out of the space he was at in his best, and I still think the disconnected sprawl makes this a little tougher to connect with in any way, even if it does get a little closer in patches. So, you know what, Extremely Light 7 out of 10, it will grow on you a bit, but it's not quite great. At least for me. Next up from Bad Lad, Lunatic. So this was an album that dropped about 6 months ago that one of my patrons requested, suggesting he was in a similar lane to Ghostemane, maybe even being better, a super aggro, SoundCloud-inspired hardcore rap act calling himself a rage act hailing from the UK. Suffice to say, I was a fair bit less impressed, because across the board the closer analog is probably 6ix9ine, minus the gang connections and the sexual assault charges, but with considerably worse mixing. See, there's a difference between ugh, this sounds gross, and ugh, this sounds gross and amateurish as all hell. And on Bad Lad's first two albums, the bass and vocal layering was literally so bad, I couldn't even take his howling obnoxiousness all that seriously, let alone think it was scary or intimidating. But alright, fine, 3 albums in, maybe there's something here. My god, I tried with this. It's not good whatsoever. And I'm starting with the production. Again, if you have someone with as much nasal, howling, in-your-face presence as Bad Lad, giving him trap acoustic guitars and a smattering of blaring synths and terrible percussion mixing, just makes him sound utterly ridiculous without more behind him, no matter how many vocal filters you're dropping in. He's trying to be this huge, mugging presence, but the blown-out vocal blending opposite the clunky bass is again so bad, so amateurish, it kills the atmosphere in the crib. And that's before he tries to force some sung vocals as a bad Trippie Redd imitation, or some clunky auto-tune, and it just sounds laughable in this swamped out mix. For God's sake, he can't even keep the volume mix consistent between tracks. That's how Bush League this sounds. Now, that's not saying there isn't a place for this sort of sound or approach, but if you can't wrangle good hooks or emphasize your assets as a villainous shithead effectively, that's a problem. And again, it's an issue on the songs where he tries to rap instead of scream. Even in a UK hip-hop mold, he references a bunch of UK colloquialisms and pop culture, and it really sounds goofy as all hell. And as an MC, a lot of his subject matter, his very basic material of getting fucked up so he could go shooting and fucking people, it isn't all that creative or all that distinctive. The one passable balance of enraged angst with rap metal aggro swagger probably was Pain, for as much death metal as it tried to dial into, but it's also one of the few songs that sounds competently mixed. And even with the horrible mixing, I think Used to Be as a closer kind of worked better than I thought it would. But as a whole, yeah, no. This is the sort of edgelord shit I don't find remotely intimidating or impressive or punchy, and Bad Lad can be excruciatingly annoying and one-dimensional, but when your production is this bad, you're not even giving yourself a chance to succeed here, even on his own terms. So, no, this is terrible. Strong 2 out of 10, not at all recommended. But you know what? Speaking of Ghostemane, and on the subject of edgelord material, from Ghostemane, Anti-Icon. Honestly, kind of surprised I haven't gotten more requests for this guy. I'm almost reminded of the buzz that picked up in the mid-90s in the underground for nu metal before it seemed to crash onto the mainstream without warning and shock so many critics who weren't paying attention. And given that I have actually already seen Ghostemane live before reviewing a project and saw how intense that crowd experience got, I got the impression this guy's at least worth paying attention to. He's got a big audience. So I went through his back catalog, a lot of which was self-produced, which feeds into my thinking that Ghostemane, he might have more ideas than the impulse to curate and focus them all that well, which doesn't help him get away from the very, very obvious influences in his sound and some of the utterly ridiculous edgelord posturing. Now again, contrary to my popular belief, and my last review, I know that there's some edgy shit that can work for me, but that normally comes through refinement and strong hooks, or at the very least a convincing visceral presence in the context or the sound, but too often for Ghostemane it just translates pretty badly on record, either let down by some bad mixes, some really questionable delivery, a lack of tune or groove, or just underwhelming lyrics. Gulch or clipping or lingua ignota, this is not. But alright, fine. I did think the production got better on that 2018 album, so I did want to hear this. And you know what? I do hear this as a step forward. I'm still waiting for Ghostemane to really transcend his influences for something more potent or unique. And I think Anti-Icon kind of wallows in some of those influences, specifically 90s industrial metal and nu metal, and especially Nine Inch Nails. Now, again, not quite a bad thing. This is more downward spiral in terms of texture than The Fragile, which is a positive, with hydrochloride probably being the most flagrant and best example of that. And Ghostemane seems to finally have the production competency to nail some of the atmosphere and a stronger groove. Yes, you know what? Even in some of the acoustic and live bass passages, it sounds pretty decent, even if I think the hooks can still be very hit and miss. And unlike many of his peers, he does have a command of subtlety and menace that matches his more guttural, haunted delivery. I mean, it doesn't work for his nasal yelping or some of the choppy nu metal barking, but I'm assuming you'll find a way to make that work eventually, or he'll grow out of it. I mean, I also hope he's gonna grow out of the daddy issues, or at least temper some of the edgier sadomasochistic impulses with something that's a little less obviously cliched. Which is why I actually found myself a bit surprised that I found his renegade anti-music industry songs like AI, Fed Up, and even Hell Rap, they had some haunted presence. And even if I couldn't get away from a lot of the Marilyn Manson feelings lurking around antisocial masochistic rage, I can't deny its twisted vibe. It had some impact even before the uncomfortable ASMR choking noises. And you know what? The bleak observation of a former partner's trauma, it's actually pretty tastefully done and feels genuinely empathetic on falling down. It's a really good closer. It's a sign of what, with a little bit more refinement and dramatic focus, what Ghostemane can do. That being said, he's still a ways away from a coherent album, or one that can truly elevate its atmosphere and edgelord tendencies beyond the fragments. But this might be the first time I consider it's a legit good album all the way through. So strong 6 out of 10. Looking forward to getting back in the pit for this. I think it'd be pretty wild. Next up, from Bree Runway, 2000 and Forever.
Better watch your back, better say that shit, better watch your back.
I'm not surprised that Bree Runway showed up on my schedule in some capacity pretty much multiple times now. I've already covered her in my song reviews on IGTV, at Spectrum Pulse if you're curious, and with this being her debut mixtape with Missy Elliott as a feature, that says there's some real attention behind her right now. And I kinda get get why. She's got a flamboyance and a pop flavor that lets her straddle a broader variety of synths and wheedling guitar tones within modern, dance-ready pop rap, even with some rock touches. And there's still some bouncy personality here, while still maintaining an aggressive and slightly rougher edge, where you'll actually come to realize the Missy Elliott feature is far from a coincidence. But I also will say this feels more like a quick taster than a fully fleshed out project. Outside of a bonus remix featuring Rico Nasty, this chart's under 20 minutes, and it runs pretty damn fast too. Not saying that there aren't some pretty good moments that stand out. I already talked before about the bassy, old school clatter and flow of Damn Daniel, but there's also the fizzy but beefy rap rock of Little Nokia, or the blown out SoundCloud banger of No Sir Freestyle. But I also say it's kind of hard not to feel like the tape starts running a little short on unique lyrical ideas pretty fast, especially when you get the perfunctory steps towards R&B, or when the songs start getting way shorter. Again, it just doesn't feel like there's a lot to it. I will say that I'm interested to hear where Bree Runway might take this going forward, but I'm also looking for where she's a little bit more distinctive than the field, and I'm not seeing a lot just yet. So while it's good, I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. I do want to hear more. There's more potential, right? Next up from Novo Amor, Cannot Be Whatsoever.
Don't make a mess of my love.
So this is my introduction to Novo Amor, and what struck me immediately was how out of place his sound feels in the modern zeitgeist. Very willowy vocals with a lot of soft focus, reverb, and falsetto against very gentle acoustic folk and chamber pop touches. Think very late 2000s music that wouldn't have pleased the Pitchfork set, who would have already had Bon Iver by this point, but it could have very easily crept into adult alternative radio or a mumblecore soundtrack and probably would have been pretty good for it. And if you thought that was going to change on this new album, which is embracing more warmer pop touches with the slightly synthesized vocals and make the Bon Iver parallel even more flagrant, well, yeah, it's still obvious, but I do think Novo Amor managed to find some quality here regardless, maybe just by being a little bit less ambitious. Specifically in the writing, as yes, it's absolutely the sort of conflicted breakup album full of moping, about faces, and Hail Marys that's trying to salvage his feelings before getting his act together, although I will say it's made more interesting and less insufferable by not so much having an arc, but starting by making the mature decision and then cracking under the weight of his own isolated emotions before trying to pull himself together and realizing a lot of the hard work he needs to do on himself. Now, it also helps when this album gets a little bit more twangy and warm. Novo Amor will stray away from his falsetto, which is nearly constant on the album, and it works to some pretty good results in the harmonies, especially as he does have a pretty solid pop instinct, if not the swell or scale of a Bon Iver or Sundays. I will say that does become a bit of an issue on the dreamier cuts. They can get a little bit drippy and kind of lost in themselves, especially as some of the keyboard blending can be a little bit thin. And you know, to my surprise, this actually feels really short. It runs only about a half hour, very economical with its time, but if it had a little bit more development and expansion, I might have been just fine with that. I liked a lot of what I was hearing. Overall though, not a lot to say about this outside of being some very pleasant, if solid and expected indie folk, so 7 out of 10. I like it. If you're curious, check it out. Next up from Kylie Minogue, Disco. So the last time I reviewed Kylie Minogue was in 2018, which I literally forgot about because she did that pop country detour with Golden that was so insubstantial I only remembered the clumsiness in which she approached the genre experimentation, and I covered the album on the trailing edge. I didn't have much to say then. But if I'm looking at the last decade of Kylie Minogue, it feels like she's been struggling to claim a sound as hers, which can be a bit frustrating because while she's never really been a trailblazer in pop, there are absolutely sounds that work great for her, which is why I was kind of anticipating this album. It wouldn't be unfamiliar territory, but hell, if the album could live up to its title, I could at least see Kylie Minogue kind of matching what Jessie Ware or Robin or Roisin Murphy have done in recent years. And Well, that's pretty much exactly what happened, but Kylie Minogue's tones aren't really playing so much that first wave of late 70s, 80s disco, so much as the pop-centric rollick that built staying power around the turn of the millennium, which is kind of ironic to me, if only because it feels like Kylie might be reminiscing for a sound in which she had way more success, just with slightly cleaner and, I'll call it classier arrangements than a lot of her original, much sharper electronic tones, with the touches of vocal production maybe even reminding folks of that Daft Punk album from 7 years ago. Honestly, and you know what, I think I'm about to be the only person who will ever make this connection, some of the production here kind of reminds me of the sugary but irrepressibly catchy grooves from mid-period S Club 7, just with much better bass lines. And a lot of the vocal harmonies and content, they aren't all that far removed from it either. But I am self-aware enough to realize that for as much as I might have nostalgia for that era, some of the production can sound very painfully canned and kind of plastic, especially when the horns will flood in opposite the faster guitar rollick, where Kylie picks up some more robotic nasal vocal layers, which are less flattering than when Daft Punk do it. So for every solid cut like Magic, or Say Something, or Dance for Darling, or Celebrate You, we get songs like Where Does the DJ Go, which has the promising hook, but every single nasal tone there drives me nuts. And while lyrics have not been a point worth caring about from Kylie Minogue for a while now, I can't say there's anything memorable or distinct that she really puts on this album in terms of content. Nothing that's an obvious dud, but very little that will elevate a song either, or make them all that distinct. But as a whole, you know, I don't want to say that Kylie Minogue is coasting, but she has done material in this ballpark better before for decades, and while this is generally likable, I'm not hearing a lot that puts this over the top for me in terms of standouts with deeper pathos, or even songs that feel incredibly unique, so strong 6 out of 10. It's good, folks, just not quite great. And finally, from Little Mix, Confetti.
Another break of song. Turn it up, let it play on and on and on and on.
This was my most anticipated album of the week. And yeah, I'm dead serious about that, because this was going to be the true test for Little Mix. They were finally freed from the clutches of Simon Cowell and Psycho Music. They were on a new label with RCA. They had adequate time to assemble a tight pop project, and pop as a genre has had a strong year. I was legit excited to see if they could stick the landing, and let me start by saying it's an improvement. It's nice to hear the girls with the real production budget again instead of LM5. The harmonies are as good as ever, and even though I think some of the mixes are a bit compressed or a little bit saturated in reverb they don't need, it's not obtrusive to the point of distraction, and you can tell there are slightly more distinctive hooks here. That being said, if Little Mix was looking to land solidly on their feet with Confetti, this might be a messier landing than they had predicted, and it mostly comes down to questions of what their identity is within pop right now. Part of this is inescapable given the weird transitionary period we are somewhat with mainstream pop right now. So on the album we get the overweight bassy pop trap, some hip hop, some R&B, some synth pop moments, and a few telling callbacks to late 90s pop in the vocal harmonies, albeit with a little bit too much unnecessary auto-tune, and it just has the feel of trying to impress maybe a few too many audiences while not doubling down on the rich, expressive harmonies that's always been Little Mix's strongest asset. They can all really sing. And while we're not quite getting hooks that punch the level of the best of Get Weird or Glory Days or even Salute, given the majority of Little Mix albums are kind of messy, I'm a bit more tolerant to some of the spottiness here, especially if at the end of the day we're gonna get Breakup Song, Happiness, and If You Want My Love, which are all great. I will say we're also now at the point where there are certain producers and writers that can give them stronger results longer term, which on this album are Camille, Goldfingers, and MNEK. So a tighter and more focused team with the girls taking more writing responsibilities probably lead to a more focused project, and it's also where I'd argue if there's a place where Little Mix is starting to stagnate a bit, it might be the writing. Where they've always been good are in the righteous kiss-off songs, the more complex girlfriend camaraderie, and the occasional party or hookup jam, but when you're 6 albums in and the most distinctive moment in your content is the expected middle finger to Simon Cowell on a song that's called called Not a Pop Song, I'm left missing the more creative stuff they had in the mid-2010s that stuck out a little more. So I'm gonna say it, light 7 out of 10. It's probably more transitional to reestablish themselves on RCA, get more creative license. Let's just hope they use it well going forward. I got expectations now. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I imagine I said some contentious things there. There's the comments. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting my channel, the link to my Patreon is right over there. Also, a chance to get involved in my schedule. I understand it's tough times for folks right now. Please don't feel any obligation. But if you want to, options available. Beyond that, if you have anything else to say about any of this, anything I can do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.